So, welcome to your Managing Population Case Studies presentation. This video is going to go through the key aspects that you need to know about your birth control policy, which is China's one-child policy, and the non-birth control policy, which is Transmigration in Indonesia. For both of these policies, you need to know what they are, why they were implemented, how they were implemented, what their successes and failures were, recent changes that have occurred, and how sustainable the policy is. So I'm going to start with China's one-child policy, which in the exam could be termed birth control policy. Now, in 1959, 1961, they suffered massive famines and they lost a lot of people. As a result, in 1979, to stop famines happening again, they introduced the one-child policy. The policy means that you're allowed one successful birth as a couple, and that's quite crucial in that if you had a disabled child that was not able to support you in old age, then you were allowed a second child. Women were not allowed to marry until they were 22 years old, and men when they were 20, with the idea being that the later you got married, less years that you would have to get pregnant and have that child. So, idea reducing you from having maybe one or two extra children. How did they enforce the policy? So they had the carrot, which is benefits for obeying the policy, which included a 5 to 10% salary increase, being given priority housing, pensions and family benefits, and your child would get free education. However, if you chose to disobey the policy, then you've got the stick or the punishments, which were in some cases a 10% salary cut, or you'd have a fine imposed on the family, and sometimes it was so large it would bankrupt the family. And then free education or healthcare would not be provided for either child. So we're just going to review some of the successes and failures of the policy. So successes may also come up in questions in terms of benefits, positive impacts or positive outcomes, and they include the fact that the fertility rate has dropped. It's gone from 5.7 in 1990 to 1.8 today. So the policy achieved what it set out to do. The fertility rate, the number of babies being born, has decreased. There have been, as a result, 400 million fewer births, so there are 400 million fewer people due to the policy being implemented. Having less people means that there's been less pressure on resources such as water, as well as housing, healthcare, education and law enforcement. So you've got less kind of social pressures, but also an environment with the less demand on the landscape for water. Single children get more attention from their parents, and this overall population policy has helped China achieve its economic growth. The negatives or the failures or the problems or negative outcomes of the policy are that boys are preferred over girls, so for working on the farms and for looking after parents in old age. Part of this problem is the fact that when girls marry, they are responsible for supporting their husband's family, not their own family. So boys are deemed to be the one that they would more likely like to have. As a result, people deliberately aborted or killed baby girls, and this is called female infanticide, so that they could have a second chance of having a boy. So the boy was the desired child. Because of this, there's a gender imbalance. So there's 120 men to 100 women. This means that some men may never marry, and it's led to an increase in rape and prostitution. Population is also now ageing, and this can be a problem for future economic growth. Okay, so they're going to have lots of old people at the top of their population pyramid, and there's going to be very few workers coming through for the economically active section. So that's a possible future issue to consider. On the positive side, you've got children getting more attention. However, they've become a bit too spoilt. So there's now something called Little Empress Syndrome. So you've got little obese Chinese children, mainly boys, spoilt boys, who have got poor social skills because parents have done everything for them. They don't have the concept of family. They don't know how to interact and share. And lastly, there's the 4-2-1 problem, whereby a single child is supporting two adults and then supporting two sets of grandparents. So there's a balance between the positives and the negatives. You may be asked to come to a decision about which is what you agree with. Do you think it's been more successful or are there more negatives? So we need to consider how the policy has changed recently. And by recently we mean the 1990s. And we need to consider why these changes have happened. So couples who are both single children themselves can now have two children. And this is to reduce the 4-2-1 problem. So rather than one couple having two sets of parents to support and two sets of grandparents, and that's a lot of pressure to provide for your one job for those people. You're allowed to have 2 children so that those 2 children below you can then support you in old age as well. In rural areas, couples can have 2 children, so the idea of children being needed on the farm has been considered. So children weren't getting registered before and they were hidden from society and basically not having a real life. To avoid that and to kind of cope with the fact that farmers need 2 children, they now are allowed to have 2 children. If people are from a national minority, they can have 2 children to keep that culture going. And if a child is born with a disability, that means that they won't be able to look after their parents in old age and that they're going to be dependent on their parents for their life, then a second child is allowed. So this is so that parents have someone able-bodied to support them in old age, because there's no pension system like in the UK. We then need to consider how sustainable China's population policy is. So just to break down sustainability for you again, I'm sure your teacher's gone over this loads and loads of times, but in simple terms, it means that the things we do today do not compromise future generations. So we can say that China's one-child policy has helped with sustainability. This is because the population has not grown as fast or as big as it would have done without having the policy. In fact, we've got 400 million fewer people. This means that fewer resources have been used, so there are more resources available for the future generations of China. So it is sustainable. There are issues with it about it being aging, but for the time being, China's population policy is sustainable. Your second case study on population policies is a non-birth control policy, and this is Indonesia's Transmigration policy. So Indonesia is a group of islands in Oceania, and it's actually a country. The main islands, or known as the core, are Java and Bali, and in 2004 these islands had the 4th largest population in the world. And the high population density on Java and Bali meant there were not enough resources to cope with the population, so there was overcrowding, lack of housing, diseases were dominant, so basically you've got lots of slum settlements developing. So the policy that the government put in place was this idea of transmigration, where people are moved from the main islands of Java and Bali, known as the core, to new farming settlements on the outer islands, called the periphery, to spread out the population. So they weren't stopping the birth rate from being high, it was about spreading the people out onto the land that they had and making the use of the land as a resource. You need to be able to compare China's one-child policy, which is a birth control policy, to a non-birth control policy. And your example for this is Indonesia and its transmigration policy. So Indonesia is a group of islands in Oceania, and the main islands are Java and Bali. And in 2004, these islands had the 4th largest population in the world. And the high population density, and this was caused by a high birth rate of 18.1 per thousand and a death rate of 6.26. So lots of people being born, not many people dying, so the population was increasing at a rapid rate. So this means that on the islands of Java and Bali, there just aren't enough resources to cope with the population. So you've got overcrowding, slum development, and diseases becoming dominant. So Indonesian government worked out a policy. They are based on a collection of islands, and not all the islands are being used. So the government moved people from the main islands of Java and Bali, known as the core, to new farming settlements that they made up on the outer islands, called the periphery, to spread out the population and to share out the resources more evenly. So how did they make people follow the policy? So unlike China, the policy was voluntary. So people were encouraged to move, and they were encouraged through the use of incentives. They were provided with 2 hectares of land that they personally owned and had legal right to. They were given fertiliser and pesticides for the first 3 years of their movement. They were given a wooden house and basic farming tools to help them get on their feet with their farm. And schools and healthcare centres and roads were made on the islands. So lots of incentives to encourage these people that were living in slums, really poor conditions, no jobs, no ownership of their land, children not able to go to school, to move to these outer islands where these incentives, these opportunities were provided for them. So some people did move, and there were a number of successes and failures of this policy, which again you need to be able to compare and contrast against China. So some areas of the islands developed into food-producing areas, giving people jobs and an income, and this then added money to the Indonesian government and its economy. The schools that were built on the islands were cheaper, so transmigration children could attend school for longer as the parents could afford the fees for more years, so it was giving their children more life opportunities. The status of women also improved on the islands, as they play a crucial role in helping the men with farming, trading and making home crafts. However, each family cost the government $7,000, and they borrowed this money from the World Bank, so it put them into debt. So it was a lot of money that was outlaid to get this policy up and running and to move these people. The islands that they were moving people to were not empty. There were actually indigenous people there, and this led to violent fights, which led to hundreds of deaths. So these fights were between the original people on the islands called Dayaks and the transmigration people who were called Maduris. The migrants who were moving had limited farming skills, and the clearing of the trees, so these are tropical rainforest trees, stopped the nutrient cycle, so the amount of crops grown was lower than expected. Because the migrants were using the land for farming, they were cutting down the trees because they needed the land underneath it, so this caused increased deforestation on the islands, which could potentially have a global impact because we're getting rid of basically the Earth's lungs, which is our tropical rainforest trees. So you've got a number of negatives and a number of positives of this policy. Make sure you know at least 2 positives, 2 negatives, and that you've got a couple of facts in there. So with regards to recent policy changes and why these changes have happened, we can look firstly at the idea of financial difficulties. So recent financial difficulties have reduced the number of people moving. The government simply didn't have enough money to keep funding that $7,000 fee that was for moving the people to the outer islands. But in 2006, an estimated 20,000 families were still moving to the outer islands, so that's a significant number. And then in 2010, Mount Merapi erupted, and the government offered to relocate 2,000 families to Kalimantan, one of the outer islands, from Java, one of the core islands. So the policy has been scaled down, but is still actively going on. The last thing to consider about the transmigration non-birth control policy is this concept of sustainability. So China's policy was sustainable because it reduced the population, less resources were used, so there's more available for the future. In contrast, Indonesia's transmigration policy has not helped with sustainability. This is because it's only reduced the impact of population growth by spreading people out across the islands. The population is still getting bigger as nothing has been done to control the birth rate. So people are still having lots of babies, less people are dying as medical care is increasing, and they still have the same number of resources. So it spread the problem out, but they haven't tackled the root cause that there's too many people being born. The policy also cost a lot of money, and it destroyed tropical rainforests for future generations. So transmigration policy in Indonesia is not sustainable or has not achieved sustainable population control. So we come to how this information is going to be used in your exam. You can see here that I've put 6 different extended questions ranging between 6 and 8 marks, 6 for foundation, 8 for higher. There's lots of different ways you could be tested on this knowledge. It could be just describe one policy with regards to how it was done, its successes, its problems, or how sustainable it is, or it could be a comparison. So in the first question, we've got name the country you've studied where strategy has been used to influence natural population change. Describe the strategies which you used and assess the extent to which they have been successful. So in question number 1, you could use either policy, transmigration or China's one-child policy. Question 2, describe and explain the successes and problems of a non-birth control policy used to control population growth. So you have to talk about the successes and problems of non-birth control. That would be Indonesia. Number 3, compare the policies used in China to control rapid population growth with the policies used in one other named country. Our other named country would be Indonesia. 4, describe the features of China's family planning policy since the 1990s. Quite crucial there, it's asking you for a specific time period. Use figure 3. You must use the figure that is provided and your own knowledge. You must have some own knowledge to go in there to get level 3. Explain why there are concerns about the effects on China's one-child policy. So this is talking about the ageing population and the gender imbalance between males and females. So again, it's that key 1990s. What's happened since 1990s, which is the ethnic minorities, the rural areas, the 421 problem being solved by being allowed 2 children. Number 5, compare the effectiveness. So that's another word for the problems and positives of the policy. So you're given a judgment as to how successful they've been to control rapid population growth, and you're comparing it with one other named country, which for us is Indonesia. Then number 6, describe a non-birth control policy that's been used to address the issues of rapid population growth in a named country. So you are describing the Indonesian policy, because that is our non-birth control policy. So we had to do China, and we have to know about China's policy and the changes since 1990s, what it is, how it was done, successes, failures, and sustainability. We have then chosen to compare it to Indonesia, which is a clear-cut non-birth control policy. Hopefully this presentation has been helpful. I would suggest that you attempt some of these exam questions as good practice ready for the exam. Okay, I wish you the best of luck.